Imagine this. We live in an age of self-driving cars, artificial intelligence, space tourism, and 24-hour access to everything. We call ourselves civilized, enlightened, advanced. Yet turn on the news, scroll through social media, or sit in on a family dinner that turns political, and you'll see it, the same primal instinct that once fueled tribal wars still burns beneath the surface. We've traded swords for smartphones, battlefields for comment sections, and yet the impulse remains. We still fight. We fight over opinions, beliefs, ideologies, identities. We fight over who's right and who's wrong, who belongs and who doesn't. And the question that echoes through history is still the same: why? Why do we, in a world capable of curing diseases and exploring galaxies, remain addicted to conflict? Think about it. The same species that builds cathedrals, museums, and universities also builds missiles, tanks, and online hate mobs. The same minds that compose symphonies and write poetry also craft propaganda and design weapons. It's a paradox that stretches through the centuries, from the ruins of ancient empires to the polarized comment threads of our digital age. And it forces us to ask something uncomfortable. Maybe war isn't just something that happens out there. Maybe it's something that begins in here, inside the human heart. You see, we like to believe war is an aberration, a glitch in the system, something caused by bad leaders or broken politics. But if you study history long enough, the pattern becomes undeniable. Conflict isn't an exception to human life, it's a constant. When one kind ends, another begins, often under a new name. And here's the hard truth: the battlefield has simply changed its form. It's no longer only soldiers facing each other across trenches. It's neighbors arguing online, families divided over ideology, co-workers turning disagreements into cold wars. The terrain of battle has moved from the earth to the psyche. Why does this matter? Because understanding this is the first step toward breaking the cycle. If war is only external, then peace depends on politicians and treaties. But if war is also internal, then peace starts with us, with you and me. That's a radically empowering idea. It means you're not powerless. It means you can stop contributing to the noise, to the hostility, to the quiet wars we wage every day without realizing it. Now, let's be honest. The world has never been free from division. Every generation thinks it's living through unprecedented chaos, but the truth is, humans have always found reasons to fight. Over land. Over gods. Over skin color. Over words. The reasons evolve, but the psychology doesn't. There's something in us that craves opposition, something that feels more alive when it has an enemy. On some level, we need someone, or something, to fight against. It gives us purpose, structure, belonging. Us versus them feels simpler than the messy complexity of real life. And that's where the trouble begins. Because once you define yourself by who you oppose, you stop growing. You stop listening. You stop connecting. You start living in a fortress built out of your own certainty, terrified of what might happen if you opened the gate. And that fortress becomes a prison. Every angry tweet, every self-righteous rant, every conversation that turns into a shouting match, it's not just conflict. It's a symptom. A sign that the war outside has a mirror inside. Now, this might sound abstract, but look around. Our culture rewards outrage. The louder you shout, the more attention you get. The more you dehumanize your opponent, the more applause you receive from your own side. The algorithm loves conflict, it feeds on it. And we, without even noticing, become soldiers in a digital battlefield, fighting for likes, retweets, and validation. Have you ever caught yourself arguing online with someone you'll never meet, defending a point that doesn't even affect your real life? That's the unconscious pull of the same instinct that once made tribes paint their faces and sharpen their spears. The weapons changed. The psychology didn't. But there's something else beneath that instinct, something older and deeper: fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being wrong. Fear of insignificance. And fear always seeks an enemy. When we can't face what scares us within, we project it outward. We turn the unknown into a villain. It's easier to fight a person than to face a feeling. Easier to hate a group than to confront your own insecurity. And that's where the true paradox lies. Our wars, big and small, are often just reflections of the battles we refuse to fight inside ourselves. So, when you look at the state of the world today, at the anger, the division, the constant outrage, don't just see politics. See psychology. See humanity acting out its unresolved inner conflicts on a global stage. That realization isn't meant to depress you. It's meant to awaken you. Because once you understand that war isn't only something that happens between nations but also between egos, you begin to see your role differently. You stop asking, when will they change, and start asking, what part of this pattern am I feeding? And here's where it gets even more powerful. If the impulse for conflict comes from within, then so does the possibility of peace. True peace doesn't begin with treaties or speeches. It begins in the mind that refuses to see the other as the enemy. It begins when you recognize the same fear, the same longing, the same humanity in the person standing opposite you. That's not weakness, it's awareness. And awareness is strength. Because awareness breaks the spell. It reminds you that you always have a choice, to react or to reflect, to attack or to understand, to fight or to build. We have to start seeing peace not as the absence of war but as a conscious act of rebellion against our own unconscious patterns. Every time you choose to listen instead of shout, you break the cycle. Every time you choose curiosity over judgment, you disarm the inner soldier. Every time you recognize that the enemy is often just a mirror, you reclaim your power. That's how real revolutions begin, not on battlefields, but in awareness. So, as we move forward, keep this in mind, the world doesn't change because the powerful decide to be kind. It changes when ordinary people like you, stop feeding the fires of unconscious conflict. When they choose understanding over fear and courage over reaction. Because in the end, the question isn't why do we fight? The question is, how long are we willing to keep living like this? And maybe, just maybe, the answer begins the moment you realize that the war outside is only a reflection of the one within. If we really want to understand why we keep fighting, we have to go further back than Twitter fights, political campaigns, or even modern wars. We have to dig into the older layers of human history, the ones before skyscrapers, before constitutions, before we even had written language. Because there's a romantic idea that floats around in pop culture and even in some philosophy, that once upon a time humans were peaceful, living in harmony with nature, sharing berries, dancing around fires, and only later did civilization corrupt us. Rousseau called it the noble savage idea. It sounds beautiful. It also doesn't match what we actually find when we look at bones, ruins, and real archaeology. When archaeologists started uncovering prehistoric burial sites, they didn't just find tools, pottery, and animal bones. They found skulls cracked by clubs, ribs pierced by arrows, skeletons buried in hurry-up mass graves, settlements surrounded by defensive ditches. People thousands of years ago were not wandering around holding hands with everyone. They were protecting their people, their food, their territory. In some prehistoric cemeteries, a shocking percentage of bodies show signs of violent death. That tells us something the modern mind doesn't like to admit: violence is not a recent invention. It's one of humanity's oldest habits. Think about that for a second. Long before there were nation-states, before there were presidents, before anyone could blame the media, human beings were already organizing, defending, attacking. Early farmers in Europe didn't just build homes and fields, they built palisades and walls. Why? Because someone might come and take what they had. That's not civilization corrupting the pure heart. That's humans doing what humans have always done, drawing circles around what matters and being ready to fight to protect it. And here's the part that's really interesting. Some anthropologists argue that early warfare wasn't only about survival or greed. Sometimes it was a way for small groups to avoid becoming dominated by one leader. In other words, conflict wasn't always chaos, it sometimes functioned like a release valve for power. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Even today, we sometimes create tension or drama in order to rebalance a situation that feels like it's slipping out of our control. So what does that mean for us, living in suburbs and cities, working office jobs or running businesses? It means that the impulse to divide the world into us and them is much older than our current politics. It's baked into the way human groups formed. To know who we are, we've always defined who we are not. Our ancestors didn't have brand identities, football teams, or political parties, so they used tribes, clans, and neighboring villages. We were the ones who spoke our language, wore our clothes, honored our ancestors. They were the ones outside the circle. And once that they existed, so did the possibility of conflict. We like to think we're way more sophisticated now, but swap out tribe for party, denomination, lifestyle, or online community, and the psychological structure is the same. Here's the punchline: if humans have been doing this for thousands of years, then our modern conflicts aren't just about the specific issues we say they're about. They're also expressions of an ancient pattern. That's why arguments today can feel way bigger than the topic. You've seen it. Two people start debating work-from-home policies or school choices, and within minutes it feels like they're fighting for their lives. Why? Because deep down, belonging still feels like survival. Being on the wrong side still feels like danger. Our nervous system doesn't know the difference between being excluded from a Neolithic village and being dragged in a Facebook thread. Rejection still hurts. Threat still activates us. So we react like people always have. We defend, we attack, we close ranks. This is where the audience needs to hear something sobering. If conflict is that old, then we can't just blame modern society for it. We can't say, well, if politicians were better, we'd all get along, or if social media didn't exist, people wouldn't be so angry. Social media didn't create polarization, it amplified something that was already inside us. Politics didn't invent the urge to control, it harnessed it. What we're seeing now is not a new monster, it's an old instinct wearing modern clothes. And that's actually good news, because once we recognize the pattern, we can work with it instead of pretending we're above it. So let me ask you directly, where do you still use conflict to feel secure? Where do you pick fights, out loud or in your head, because it helps you feel like you're on the right side? Maybe it's the way you talk about those people who don't get it. Maybe it's how you dismiss family members who voted differently. Maybe it's the subtle way you compete with other parents, coworkers, or even your spouse. Ancient humans built ditches and fences. We build sarcasm, moral superiority, and passive-aggressive posts. Different tools, same purpose, guard the territory of the self. Here's the bridge to where we're going next. If conflict has always been with us, then the real question isn't why did humans start fighting? We already know, they fought because it helped them survive, organize, define identity. The real question for a modern, conscious adult is, why am I still running a Stone Age program in a 21st century life? Why am I still treating every disagreement like a threat? Why does being challenged feel like being attacked? That's where psychology comes in. Because at some point in our evolution, the battlefield stopped being only physical and started becoming psychological. We stopped just protecting land and started protecting ego. We stopped just defending food and started defending narratives. And that shift, from outer defense to inner defense, is what we need to unpack. History shows us that conflict is ancient. Psychology will show us why it's still so personal. And that's exactly where we're headed. To really understand why conflict keeps resurfacing in every generation, we have to leave the realm of history and step into the human mind. Because war doesn't start with a bullet, it starts with a thought. It starts with the story we tell ourselves about who we are and who the other is. Philosophers and psychologists have been wrestling with this for centuries. Thomas Hobbes, writing in the 1600s, had a grim but brutally honest view of humanity. He said that without a strong power-keeping order, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. For Hobbes, humans left alone would devour each other. Competition, fear, and pride were natural. Peace was not our default, it was an artificial structure held together by laws and authority. In his eyes, civilization wasn't our corruption, it was our restraint. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau disagreed completely. He said that humans in their natural state were innocent, even gentle, but that civilization, property, greed, hierarchy, poisoned that innocence. We became jealous, possessive, power-hungry. In other words, society didn't save us from war, it taught us how to wage it more effectively. These two visions, Hobbes' cynical realism and Rousseau's romantic idealism, still shape how we see human nature today. Are people basically good but corrupted by systems? Or basically dangerous and only tamed by them? The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between, and psychology helps us find it. Then came Freud, who took the conversation from the political into the personal. He saw human life as a tension between two primal forces, eros, the drive to connect, build, and love, and thanatos, the drive to destroy, dominate, and end. Freud said civilization itself is built on the constant repression of our destructive instincts. That's why it's so fragile, because what we repress eventually leaks out. Every explosion of violence, every collective hatred, every scapegoating frenzy is the return of what we tried to bury. Think about that for a moment. We don't just inherit conflict from our ancestors, we carry it inside our nervous system. The battle between creation and destruction isn't just out there, it's happening in you right now, every time you choose between compassion and control, forgiveness and revenge. But Freud's student, Carl Jung, went even deeper. He said that within every person exists what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we don't want to see, the impulses we judge, the emotions we deny. Anger, envy, lust, shame, the desire to dominate, the fear of being weak. We lock these pieces away in our unconscious because they don't fit the image we want to have of ourselves. But here's the twist, what we repress doesn't disappear, it waits. It hides, gathering energy, until it finds a way to express itself. And most of the time, it expresses itself through projection. Projection means we see in others what we refuse to face in ourselves. We call someone arrogant when we can't admit our own need for recognition. We judge someone's aggression because it mirrors our own hidden rage. We despise someone's selfishness because deep down, we fear our own. And this mechanism doesn't stop at the individual level, it scales up to the collective. Nations, religions, political movements, all of them create enemies that conveniently embody their own denied qualities. A culture that represses vulnerability will call others weak. A nation that secretly fears its own corruption will brand its rivals evil. The shadow, when unacknowledged, always demands an enemy. Jung said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But that only works if we're willing to look inward. Most people aren't. It's much easier to keep fighting, to keep projecting, to keep believing the problem is them. That's why every attempt at peace feels temporary. Because the root cause, the inner war, hasn't been addressed. It's not that humanity doesn't want peace. It's that we want peace without introspection, forgiveness without honesty, unity without vulnerability. We want peace that doesn't require us to admit we might be part of the problem. So, what happens when the shadow takes over a group, not just an individual? You get the kind of moral crusades and ideological wars we see all the time. People convinced they're saving the world but actually reenacting their own inner conflicts on a grand stage. Have you noticed how every side in every argument believes it's the righteous one? That's not coincidence, that's projection. The more someone represses their own aggression, the more they see it in others. The more guilt they feel unconsciously, the more purity they demand publicly. It's why revolutions that begin with justice so often end in purges. It's why movements for freedom sometimes turn authoritarian. The shadow doesn't vanish just because the flag changes. And this brings us to a personal truth. You can't make peace with the world if you're at war with yourself. The anger you refuse to confront will find a target. The fear you don't process will find a scapegoat. The pain you don't acknowledge will demand witnesses. Every fight you have out there is, on some level, a reflection of an unfinished battle in here. When you demonize someone else, ask yourself, what part of me am I refusing to see? Now, this doesn't mean you should excuse every injustice or stop standing up for what's right. It means you should fight consciously, not reactively. It means you pause long enough to ask whether your rage is coming from moral clarity or from a wounded ego. Because if we don't make that distinction, we just repeat history. We keep playing out the same cycle: Hobbes' fear, Rousseau's resentment, Freud's repression, Jung's shadow, without realizing it's the same story told in new clothes. So the real question isn't why are people so cruel? It's why are we still so unconscious? We've built airplanes, vaccines, and microchips, but we haven't learned how to manage our own emotions. We can map the human genome but not the human shadow. We can conquer space but not our own pride. And until we do, we'll keep projecting our darkness onto others and calling it justice. The good news? Once you understand this dynamic, you can start breaking it. You can start recognizing when your reactions are actually reflections. You can catch yourself mid-conflict and ask, what part of me am I trying to deny right now? That's where real strength begins. Because the more aware you are of your shadow, the less power it has over you, and the less likely you are to turn your inner war into someone else's battlefield. That's the bridge to the next step, understanding how those unconscious forces are not only personal but also manipulated and magnified by the systems around us. And that's exactly where we're going next. If the shadow is born inside the human mind, power learns to weaponize it. That's where war stops being just psychological and becomes political, cultural, institutional. Because once you understand human fear, our fear of chaos, of difference, of loss of control, you can use it to steer entire populations. And make no mistake, history is full of people who did exactly that. Every empire, every dictatorship, every political movement that needed loyalty began by creating an enemy. It's the oldest trick in the book. If you can convince people that their anxiety, their poverty, their uncertainty comes from those people over there, you've just built yourself an army. That's the dark genius of propaganda. It doesn't invent hatred, it organizes it. Philosopher Michel Foucault said that power isn't just about armies or laws, it's about discourse, the stories a culture tells to define what's true, what's normal, and what's dangerous. Once those stories are in place, everything else follows. The state, the media, religion, even schools, they all repeat the same pattern: shape perception, shape behavior. It's not about forcing people with weapons. It's about controlling the narrative so well that people police themselves. And the easiest way to do that? Give them an enemy. Give them a clear us end them. You can see it throughout history. In wartime posters that dehumanized the opposing side. In speeches that painted entire races as threats. In slogans that turned complex realities into simple moral binaries. And it works because it speaks directly to the unconscious, the part of us Jung warned about. The part that wants clarity, not nuance. Certainty, not complexity. The part that doesn't want to face its own darkness and would rather project it onto someone else. That's why moral crusades are so intoxicating. They let us feel righteous without doing the hard inner work. We get to call ourselves the good ones while pouring our own aggression into the fight. Now fast forward to today. You don't need an authoritarian regime to create that dynamic anymore. The technology does it for us. The algorithms know our fears better than we do. They feed us content that makes us angry, because anger keeps us scrolling. Division keeps us engaged. Outrage keeps us online. What used to require state propaganda now happens automatically, invisibly, with every swipe. And it's not just about politics. It's culture, entertainment, identity, even lifestyle. Everything gets turned into a battlefield: gender, religion, diet, parenting, you name it. The system doesn't care which side you're on as long as you stay inside the arena. As long as you keep fighting. Because fighting is profitable. That's the modern form of control, what I'd call the economy of anger. You don't need to silence people if you can distract them with endless conflict. You don't need censorship when you can keep everyone shouting past each other. The more polarized we become, the more dependent we are on the very systems that divided us. Think about that next time you see a viral post designed to make you furious. Ask yourself, who benefits when I lose my peace? Power doesn't need to invent enemies from scratch anymore, it simply amplifies the ones already living in our heads. When we scroll through our feeds and see the other side being mocked or humiliated, our primitive brain lights up. It feels good. It feels like winning. But that little hit of superiority is just another leash. Because the more addicted we become to outrage, the easier we are to manipulate. You can't think clearly when you're angry. You can't question authority when you're scared. You can't empathize when you've been taught that empathy equals weakness. And here's the thing, this isn't about conspiracies. It's not about secret rooms or shadow governments. It's about human psychology being predictable. Fear sells. Division mobilizes. Anger distracts. It's not evil in a cartoon sense, it's simply how systems sustain themselves. The moment peace becomes profitable, you'll see peace everywhere. Until then, conflict will remain the default product. But this doesn't mean we're doomed. It just means awareness is the first act of rebellion. Because once you start to see the pattern, you can stop feeding it. You can pause before reacting, before reposting, before picking sides. You can ask, is this outrage mine, or did someone sell it to me? That question alone is enough to break the trance. Because the moment you see the manipulation, you reclaim choice. There's a reason every powerful movement in history began with consciousness. When people become aware, power loses its invisibility. That's what leaders fear most, not protests, not criticism, but awareness. Because awareness makes you unpredictable. You stop marching in step. You stop repeating the slogans. You stop needing an enemy. And when you stop needing an enemy, entire systems of control begin to crumble. Now, I'm not saying turn off your phone and live in a cave. This isn't about retreating from the world, it's about re-entering it with clarity. About remembering that you can engage in politics, faith, activism, or debate without letting your shadow or someone else's agenda drive you. It's about speaking truth without turning it into a weapon. That's real freedom. So the next time you catch yourself getting pulled into a fight, online or in real life, pause. Feel the rush of indignation. Notice how it energizes you. That's the moment the machine wants you most. Because if it can get you angry, it can get you hooked. But when you choose to stay grounded, to see through the manipulation, you become something rare, a free person in an age of emotional captivity. The war for your attention is the war for your soul. Power doesn't need your agreement, it needs your reaction. Don't give it so easily. Remember, the loudest voice isn't always the truest, and the simplest narrative is almost never the complete one. Truth lives in the quiet spaces, the ones you can only reach when you stop shouting and start listening. That's the paradox of modern war. It's not fought with bombs, but with words. Not over land, but over perception. And until we learn to see how discourse shapes our minds, we'll keep playing someone else's game. But once we do, once we understand how the stories of fear are written and sold, we gain the power to write our own. And that's the bridge to the next part of this journey, how these same patterns of division and control infiltrate our daily lives, turning ordinary relationships into battlegrounds we don't even realize we're fighting on. When most people hear the word war, they picture soldiers, smoke, tanks, and chaos. But here's the truth, war doesn't need uniforms anymore. The battlefield has moved into our daily lives, into our homes, our offices, our relationships, and even our own minds. Every time you feel the need to prove you're right, every time you treat disagreement like danger, every time you cut someone off instead of trying to understand them, you're fighting a miniature war. It might not draw blood, but it drains something just as vital, your energy, your peace, your connection to others. Modern life is full of these invisible battles. The workplace becomes a cold front where coworkers compete for recognition, hiding ambition behind politeness while quietly hoping others stumble. Families turn into quiet trenches, where unspoken resentments pile up like sandbags, each conversation ready to explode into old arguments. In marriages and relationships, conflict can start from something as small as a tone of voice, but beneath it is a deeper struggle for control, for acknowledgement, for power. You're not just arguing about who does the dishes. You're fighting over who feels seen. That's the hidden battlefield most of us don't realize we're standing on. social media only adds more fire to this war. We wake up, open our phones, and within seconds, we're inside a digital arena designed for combat. Likes and comments become weapons. Outrage becomes a kind of currency. You scroll through your feed, and it's one battle after another, someone offended, someone canceled, someone mocked. You see it, you feel something rise in you, and before you know it, you're part of it. You've taken a side, even if you don't know the full story. That's how the modern battlefield recruits its soldiers, not with guns, but with dopamine. The fight feels good in the moment. But what it's really doing is feeding your shadow. Think about it. How many times have you replayed an argument in your head hours or even days later? How often do you imagine the perfect comeback, the thing you wish you'd said to win the conversation? That's psychological warfare, but it's self-inflicted. We keep fighting in our minds long after the other person has gone to sleep. We call it standing up for ourselves, but often it's just the ego trying to keep control. The same instinct that once made our ancestors guard their villages now makes us guard our opinions, our self-image, our pride. And here's the hard truth, all that fighting takes a toll. A society that lives in constant symbolic war becomes exhausted, paranoid, and lonely. Look around. People are burned out, cynical, distrustful. We assume bad intentions before giving anyone a chance. We read hostility into neutral words. We treat discomfort like danger. Why? Because we've forgotten how to live without an enemy. We've made conflict our comfort zone. We don't know how to rest in peace, literally. But let's make it personal for a moment. Have you noticed how conflict sneaks into even your quiet moments? You're alone, but your mind is still debating, defending, attacking. The war has gone internal. You're arguing with imaginary opponents, rehearsing future confrontations, replaying old wounds. You're both the soldier and the enemy, locked in a loop. That's why many people can't find peace even in silence, because the real war isn't outside. It's between the parts of yourself you refuse to reconcile. Now, I'm not saying conflict itself is evil. Disagreement is natural, even necessary. But what we've lost is the art of disagreeing without destruction. We've forgotten how to stand firm without becoming cruel, how to express anger without poisoning the connection. Somewhere along the line, we started confusing aggression with strength. But strength isn't how loudly you can shout. It's how calmly you can stay centered when someone else does. It's how you hold your ground without losing your humanity. The problem is, our culture doesn't reward that. It rewards speed, outrage, and certainty. The one who pauses to think, to reflect, to ask questions, that person looks weak. But maybe that's exactly where power lies, in refusing to fight just because you're invited to. Imagine if, in your next argument, you didn't rush to defend yourself. You just listened. Not because you agree, but because you value your peace more than your pride. That small act is revolutionary. It's what breaks the loop. Because here's something no one tells you, every time you react with awareness instead of instinct, you reclaim energy from the war machine. Every time you choose empathy over ego, you disarm a hidden bomb. Every time you stop trying to win and start trying to understand, you step out of the battlefield entirely. That's not weakness, it's mastery. It's emotional intelligence in its highest form. And it's contagious. People around you start mirroring that calm, that grounded energy. Suddenly, the temperature in the room drops. The war loses oxygen. Now, take that idea and scale it up. Imagine workplaces where competition didn't require sabotage, families that practiced forgiveness before pride, online spaces that rewarded curiosity instead of outrage. None of that requires world peace or political revolutions. It just requires awareness. But awareness takes effort. It means noticing when your body tenses, when your voice rises, when your thoughts spiral. It means catching yourself mid-battle and realizing, wait, I don't have to keep fighting. That's how every personal war begins to end, with one conscious choice. So maybe it's time to ask yourself, what wars am I still fighting that no longer need to be fought? Who am I trying to defeat when I argue, others, or my own insecurities? What would happen if I stopped treating every disagreement as a threat and started treating it as a mirror? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they're the ones that lead to freedom. Because the war out there, on the screens, in the streets, between nations, will never stop until enough of us stop feeding it in here, in our daily lives, in the way we think, speak, and relate. The wars of history might have built nations, but the wars of ego destroy them from within. The next revolution won't come from overthrowing governments, it'll come from people mastering themselves. People who choose peace not because it's easy, but because it's powerful. And that's the path we're walking toward next, how to transform that awareness into action, to stop fighting the same battles and start building something entirely different. If everything we've explored so far is true, if conflict begins in the mind, if the shadow feeds it, and if our culture profits from keeping it alive, then the real battlefield isn't out there. It's within. And that means the solution isn't just about ending wars or silencing enemies. It's about transforming consciousness. It's about learning how to live from awareness instead of reaction. Because the truth is, peace isn't a miracle, it's a skill. And like every skill, it takes practice. So let's talk about what that practice actually looks like. It begins with one thing, self-awareness. You can't change what you refuse to see. Jung said, what is not made conscious returns as fate. In other words, if you don't face your shadow, it will run your life, and you will call it destiny. The first step out of war is radical honesty with yourself. You stop pretending you're always the hero. You stop pretending the problem is always someone else. You start noticing your patterns, the way you jump to conclusions, the way you need to be right, the way you interpret disagreement as disrespect. You start catching yourself in the act of being human. That's not guilt, it's growth. And when you do that long enough, something amazing happens. The triggers that used to set you off start losing their power. The person who once made your blood boil becomes just another person with their own pain. You begin to realize that most of the world's conflicts are just unhealed emotions colliding. You stop needing to win every argument. You stop wasting your energy trying to convince people who don't want to understand. You start choosing your battles carefully, and more often than not, you choose not to fight at all. That's not weakness. That's emotional maturity. But awareness alone isn't enough. You have to integrate it. Integration means taking all the parts of yourself, the ones you love and the ones you hide, and bringing them into the same room. It's saying, yes, I have anger. Yes, I have fear. Yes, I have control issues. But they don't control me anymore. That's how peace begins, not by suppressing the darkness, but by understanding it. Because once you understand it, it stops hijacking your life. Think of it this way, you can't steer a car if you refuse to admit you're the one behind the wheel. Now, this kind of transformation doesn't just happen on a yoga mat or in a therapy session. It happens in traffic, in meetings, in family dinners. It's in the moments when you want to lash out but choose to breathe instead. It's in the moment when someone disrespects you and you realize their behavior says more about them than it does about you. Every time you respond from awareness instead of ego, you are building inner peace like a muscle. It's slow, it's messy, and it's worth it. But let's be clear, this work isn't only personal. It's collective. Because individual awareness eventually spills into culture. The more conscious people become, the less manipulable they are. You can't divide people who understand their own projections. You can't sell hatred to someone who's already made peace with their shadow. That's why emotional awareness is revolutionary. It's the quiet rebellion that changes everything. Imagine a society that teaches kids not just math and history, but emotional intelligence. Imagine media that promotes reflection instead of outrage. Imagine leaders who can admit mistakes without shame. That's not utopia, that's evolution. And yet, none of this happens if we keep outsourcing peace to politicians, priests, or influencers. You can't legislate consciousness. You can only live it. You can only practice it every day, and how you speak, how you listen, how you forgive. Because forgiveness isn't saying what happened was okay. It's saying, I won't let it define me anymore. That's what breaks the cycle. That's what transforms pain into wisdom. Every person who learns to do that adds one small light to the human story. And light, even a little of it, changes everything. Now let's talk about something most people avoid: forgiveness toward yourself. Because yes, it's easy to talk about loving humanity in theory, but have you ever tried forgiving yourself for something you still regret? That's where most people get stuck. You can't make peace with the world if you're at war with your own past. Self-forgiveness isn't about excusing mistakes, it's about learning from them. It's about understanding that the same unconscious patterns that create global wars also create personal ones. The same mind that builds weapons can build bridges. The difference is awareness. And if that sounds too abstract, here's a concrete way to start. Next time you feel triggered, pause and ask, what part of me feels threatened right now? Maybe it's your pride. Maybe it's your need for control. Maybe it's fear of being unseen. Don't fight it. Just name it. Because once it's named, it loses its power. Then take it one step further. Ask what this situation is trying to teach you. Every conflict, no matter how small, is a classroom. Every argument is a mirror. The faster you see that, the faster you grow. But here's the most important part: peace isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. You'll slip, you'll lose your temper, you'll fall into old patterns. That doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. The key is not to stay down there. You reflect, you repair, you return to awareness. That's how you evolve. That's how every great transformation happens, not in one grand moment, but in thousands of tiny choices. So maybe the question isn't how do we end all wars? Maybe it's how do I stop being at war with myself today? Because that's where it starts. When you make peace with your shadow, when you stop needing to project it onto others, you become what Jung called an individuated human being, whole, grounded, real. And when enough people do that, the world starts to change, not through revolution, but through resonance. In the end, the goal isn't a flawless society or a silent world. It's a conscious one. A world where people can disagree without dehumanizing, compete without cruelty, lead without domination. A world where peace isn't a slogan but a lived experience. And that begins here, with you, listening to this, realizing that you have more power than you think. The war only persists where unconsciousness reigns. The moment you wake up, it loses ground. And every conscious choice you make, every time you choose awareness over reaction, is another small victory in the only battle that truly matters, the one for your own soul. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I know your time is valuable. If this message spoke to you, if it gave you even one moment of clarity or peace, I'd be grateful if you'd let me know. A simple like, a comment with your thoughts, or subscribing to the channel helps this community grow, and it helps more people who might need these words to find them. Share your reflections below. I do read them. I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, take care of your peace.